G'day crew, it's Simon Bartol from www.bartolbiomechanics again. I'm going to talk to you today about neuromas. Really common problem in the athletic population and often called a Morton's neuroma, after a famous surgeon in the 18th century who first described this particular problem. Now, it's actually pretty common in the population, both the athletic population and also the general community, and it really does create quite a few problems because it's just so painful. I see it quite often with my footballers, and it can get to a stage where it really is quite debilitating and means they have to have some games off. So what exactly is a Morton's neuroma? Well, basically, a Morton's neuroma is a benign lesion of one of the interdigital nerves. So we've got the innervation of the foot here, and the nerves run down between the bones in the joint space here, and we have one for each one of these joint spaces, and then they divide, and you get one division goes to one side of the toe, and the other division goes to the other side of the toe. The problem here is that human engineering in this case is a little less than ideal, because the division of the nerve occurs around about at the level of the metatarsal heads. Because of that, it means that the division is a little bit susceptible to irritation from the metatarsal heads, especially if we've got compression of the forefoot. So you can imagine the nerve is running down. If we've got any sort of compression of the forefoot here, it squeezes the nerve. And when you're moving over a period of time, you can get irritation, you get some thickening of the lining or the surrounding of the nerve, and it becomes thickened, and we get a benign lesion of the tumour at the level of the met heads normally. So that's actually what it is. We see it particularly in some foot types, people who've got a much wider forefoot than perhaps we would consider normal. People who squish themselves into tiny, narrow shoes are also a problem. That's why it can be an issue with footballers across all the codes, because they tend to push themselves into very narrow shoes, and that creates the compression from the side and can create an issue. Typically, it is a gradual onset, and we can see symptoms that will start off just being a bit of an unusual sensation, perhaps a little bit of tingling, some burning, occasionally radiation down to the toes. People will often describe it as like an electric sensation, and sometimes we get people describing a sensation of a pop or even a sensation of standing on a pebble. Now that's because the actual little benign growth can pop out of its bed between the metatarsals and the interosseous space here. It can actually pop out, or it can move around, and the athlete can actually be quite aware of that. So that's actually what they're feeling. Now, one of the important things to note about a neuroma, or a Morton's neuroma, is that this is one of those rare occasions where size really doesn't matter. So, in fact, you can have a very small thickening of the lesion that can create at least as big or bigger symptoms than a much larger neuroma. I've seen very large neuroma. I've seen them the size of a pea when we've imaged them, and they, just because they're bigger doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be more painful. And this is one of the challenges with the Morton's neuroma, because you can have a very small lesion that can cause very big problems, very big symptoms, and they're often very hard to image. So that brings us on to the issue of how do you actually identify the issue. I guess the first port of call for me would be diagnostic ultrasound. Diagnostic ultrasound does image a neuroma really very well, but they do have to be of a size before they're actually going to show up on ultrasound. The literature is variable on this. Some people say that you're not going to be able to see it on ultrasound unless it's 5 millimetres across. 5 millimetres is quite a decent sized neuroma, but there is some conflicting information in the literature. But I think the take-home message here is that we often will get false negatives with ultrasound. It often won't image what clinically is a neuroma. If we've got those signs of burning, tingling, numbness, sharp electric type pain, especially if we've got what's called the Mulder's sign, which is where you apply a pressure plantally and squeeze the metatarsal heads together. The neuroma will pop out of the interosseous space there, and it will really cause some discomfort. So you get this popping, painful sensation, and that's called a positive Mulder's sign. So you can have that clinically, but the ultrasound won't actually show up. The next option, I guess, from an investigation point of view is to look at MRI. And now MRI, of course, gives us such beautiful imaging of so many different things, but again, MRI doesn't always image this particular lesion the way we would want it to. So I guess the bottom line here is I think the diagnosis is clinical, so it's based on what you find in your subjective history: burning, numbness, tingling, electric type sensation, pain with compression of the foot, positive Mulder's sign. I think you're dealing with a neuroma. Alrighty, so we've made our diagnosis and we think we're dealing with a morton's neuroma. Now what are we going to do about it? Well, of course, as with most sporting injuries, we're going to exhaust our conservative measures first. So we're going to think about what we might be able to do to try to relieve the load on this. The first and simplest thing to do is to check out footwear. So obviously if you've got an athlete who's in a shoe that's either too small, and yes, that happens all the time, especially in sports like football, or too narrow for their foot, which also happens all the time, then you really are compelled to get them into a much wider shoe. Now we've got good choices here these days. We've got a lot of athletic footwear that will go up to 4E sizing for men, and it'll go to also wider sizes for women. I think that's your first port of call with a neuroma. So very, very important to get the athlete into much wider footwear. The second thing we want to try to do is we've given them a bit more space for the met heads to spread out. The next thing we want to try to do is to, I guess, provide a counterbalancing load beneath the met heads so that we can actually get some degree of separation of the joint space and allow that neuroma to free up a bit. In other words, to stop it being irritated by the met heads when you run. There's a number of different ways you can do that. You can use something really simple. You can use a simple met dome. You can see that this is a little domed rubber pad, and it simply goes behind the met heads, just behind the area of pain. And the idea is that it's going to provide a load that will separate those metatarsal heads. And there's different sizes. You know, we've got much smaller ones here for more discrete lesions. We've got different shapes. We've got different materials, and you can do all sorts of different things. You can also do a lot with an orthotic device. You can attach these met domes to an orthotic device, whether you use a custom-built device or a rigid device off a plastic cast to a prescription, which is my personal preference, or you use a prefab device, which might be very helpful in the initial stages, especially if you're wanting to see whether you can get a result with this. That type of therapy can be very helpful indeed. You can also look at mobilisation techniques. You can look at trying to get a little bit more range of motion. You can look at, I guess, at trying to free up the structures at the level of the met heads and even further back to try to just get a bit more space there. That also would be a sensible thing to do. One of the other viable options here is to look at dropping some cortisone into the area. This is a chronic inflammatory condition, so the myelin that surrounds the nerve actually gets affected, so we do get chronic inflammation occurring. If we can put cortisone accurately into the spot around where the neuroma is occurring, you can do that under ultrasound guidance these days, so you can get very accurate placement of the active medication, then that can be very, very useful. The other thing that it might be worthwhile pointing out here is that quite often we don't see this lesion in isolation. So quite often I think you see a neuroma linked up with other conditions, and particularly with plantar plate injury. So the little fibrous plate that sits underneath the metatarsal head, that's very important for the patency of the joint and holding it together, you can get a little tear in that is very, very common along with a neuroma. So cortisone can actually be very, very useful from that perspective. So I would say that they're the main conservative therapies that we would consider. If we've exhausted all those avenues, and if we have a patient who really is still in some difficulty, then I guess we have to consider the option of surgery, whereby the actual thickened part of the nerve is surgically excised. Now, as with most surgery for athletes, that really is the last resort. That's not to say that it can't be effective, because it can be, but we really want to be very sure that we've done everything else we possibly can for the condition. So normally a dorsal approach, expose the lesion and excise it. Now, one of the difficulties with this is that once you've done that, you are going to end up with a couple of numb toes, because the nerve no longer is supplying the 2 digits that it normally would, because it's gone. That's one of the difficulties. The other difficulty is you can actually develop what's called a stump end neuroma, which means that you've actually got rid of the original problem, but you get a secondary problem at the actual stump where the nerve's been excised. And that's for the same reasons. If you haven't actually sorted out the cause, if you haven't dealt with the footwear issue, if you haven't dealt with the issue of a foot pronating within a shoe that causes constriction across here, well, then you're going to have you can have exactly the same issues, the same irritation, and you can end up with a stump neuroma, which is very bad news indeed after surgery. That's something you really want to be avoiding. Okay, so that's a snapshot of Morton's neuroma. I hope you found that helpful. This is going to be a bit of a clinical series of quick clinical guides to common conditions in sports medicine. Morton's neuroma, have a think about it.